Good morning, everyone. Nice to have you here. Come on in, everybody. We are glad to have you here for Contemporary Issues class today. We are so pleased to have Dr. Judith Wilson and her husband, Ken, talking today. A lot of us at St. Andrew know Judith and Ken. They go to the 8 o'clock service here, and we know a bit about Judith's story and her diagnosis of Parkinson, and her being a proponent of everything about this. And so it's a great pleasure to have her today here to tell us more about it. Before we start, I want to welcome our Zoomers also and make a couple announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself on the lower left corner of your screen so we keep the background noise down. And can you still hear me okay? Susan on Zoom, thumbs up. Great. Okay, and Joe, thank you. And welcome to others for joining us today. And we are recording this for future playback and for folks who couldn't be here this morning. And other announcements. I want to wish Jane Watson a happy 94th birthday yesterday. Did you do anything special, Jane? Did he take you to dinner and your daughter's looking good. Good. Okay. Any other announcements? Everybody going to watch the Oscar Awards tonight? No. See what people are wearing, what they do. It's kind of an interesting cultural thing, isn't it? And we're going to talk about, we're going to do a class here in a couple of weeks on film and TV series that we recommend and enjoy. Look at it from a Christian perspective. So that will be fun. Okay, with that, I am going to do a little introduction of Dr. Judith and Ken. Dr. Judith got her medical degree from CU, School of Medicine, and was a family practice physician for many years. Ken was retired from Lockheed as an electrical design engineer. And it was around their 40th wedding anniversary in 2011 that Judith noticed symptoms that led her to receive her diagnosis. She had a much too heavy, intense work life at that time and ignored things for a while until she went in to her doctor and was referred and got her diagnosis. He says the number one prescription that he has followed is exercise, vigorous exercise. And he's explored cardio, martial arts, boxing, and balance and strength programs, bicycling, yoga, and I think I mentioned boxing. Interesting perspective, yes, for us. And she is going, and Ken are going to present a little slideshow today, tell about the condition and their experience. And they would like to allow questions while they're speaking. So if you have a short question, just raise your hand and we'll take your question. And with that, I'm going to hit the share screen on the computer so we can share the slides. Screen, and we will begin. I want to mention, by the way, we're going to talk about some of the basics of it, but we are also going to want to talk about cause, prevention, treatment, a little bit, and even theological things too. How has this affected your faith as a Christian, and what do you think about suffering and medical conditions in general when it comes to theology? So later on, we'll go into that a little bit. But with that, I want to give the microphone to Dr. Judith, because the condition does affect the voice also. It's good to project more. So here with that, please welcome Dr. Judith Wilson.
Thank you, and thank you, Steve, for your generous introduction. I am Judith Wilson. My partner in crime, Ken. Closer. Is that better? Oh, okay. I don't use these things, so you have to give me clues. Can't hear you. Okay. We're going to talk today a little bit about the basics of Parkinson's disease, which until recently was considered one of the worst possible things you could run into as an aging individual. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. Sometimes we get diagnosed really late in the game and it gets really difficult quickly. But other times we get diagnosed early and are given adequate information to be able to develop our own treatment program with the guidance of professionals that will help us progress much slower in the condition than if we were not putting a package of treatment together. I know Dottie and I met pretty early on in my diagnosis, and she could tell, nobody else could, but Dottie's been a physical therapist for a long time, and she knew just by watching me, even though this was 11 and a half years ago, and we didn't really know each other very much. But she came up to me at a conference one day and she very quietly asked me if I had Parkinson, and I was just floored because I didn't think anybody knew at that point in time. So physical therapists are some of our best friends as our occupational therapists, and sometimes they surprise me. So that was just an interesting thing that happened very early. All right, let's begin. Steve, are you going to?
We're frozen at the moment between slides, trying to get
Okay.
the computer to unfreeze.
I'm going to go ahead and
There it goes, okay.
cover the territory. So what is Parkinson's disease? And you notice there's apostrophe S, Parkinson's, but I'm saying it without the S for the most part. That's a somatic thing, a semantic thing, in that it's named after a gentleman named John Parkinson who discovered the condition in the mid-1700s. And so it's always been called his disease. But the fact is, it is not, and it was never named that. So I'll say Parkinson, once in a while I'll say Parkinson's, but mean the same thing, but technically it's Parkinson's disease. It's one of a group of neurological conditions, the nervous system of the body, and it affects your ability to move normally. There's 4 key descriptions of it that make it a movement disorder. It's chronic, doesn't go away. It's degenerative. Over time, it will continue to degrade the nervous system. It's progressive. That will go on at some level, no matter how vigorous your self-care campaign is. But you have the potential to slow it dramatically by the choices that you make when you're diagnosed. So it's incurable. Notice so far. There's a tremendous amount of research going on around Parkinson's disease at this point in time, and a surprising body of research going on in the Denver area. There are 4 or 5 major facilities that are doing substantial work in trying to get the why of this thing figured out. Next slide.
We're working
Still
on it.
working. Okay, I'm going to slide through several of these. I have a slide called acronyms, and you will see so many D's and so many P's in the acronyms having to do with dopamine, which is the chemical that's involved in the brain, Parkinson's disease, Davis-Finney, more acronyms. Parkinson Association of the Rockies. Some of you who have people that are relatively newly diagnosed may have just learned about PAR, P-A-R, Parkinson Association of the Rockies. Fantastic group. They do amazing work in this area. Parkinson Point, which is a newly developing program and organization trying to localize all the services that a person who has Parkinson needs in one place, instead of having you have to drive 7 or 8 or 9 different places in a week to get the services you need. Our aim is to get this all under an umbrella so that you go 1 time a week or 2 or 3 times at your choice, but you're not forced to be on the road all the time. Michael J. Fox Foundation, you've probably heard of. Parkinson Foundation is a national organization that provides a lot of funding to local organizations for their programming. So Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder. It means it impacts how you're able to voluntarily, physically do your life. What causes Parkinson? Well, it results from damage to a certain set of cells deep in the most primitive part of the brain. So movement is a very early function, and the things that impact movement work in the oldest part of the brain. I'll show you a little diagram here in just a moment that illustrates that. So dopamine is a chemical. It's throughout the body, but it's really concentrated. Its function is really concentrated in the brain. And the cells in the brain that produce the dopamine are located in this area of the brain that I'll show you here just quickly, called the substantia nigra. If can you put the next slide up?
Okay. Arrow. Two.
Arrow.
There we go. Okay,
Yeah.
this is a very simplistic picture of the brain, but it helps to describe what's going on with the dopamine problem. You see two black round sections deep in the diagram. And that area that's labeled the substantia nigra is one of the oldest, i.e. most primitive portions of the developing human brain. So you can see that these two little bulbs that are located there, in terms of the size of the bulbs versus the brain, they're exaggerated so that you can kind of get an idea of where they are, but they're very tiny. But they do produce in someone who doesn't have Parkinson enough dopamine to provide the body's needs. So dopamine.
Excuse me, can I just interrupt a second? Steve, can you share the screen with us?
Yes, sorry about that. Thank you.
That's
for-
okay.
Susan. Okay.
Okay,
Hang on, just. Ken, with the thing that you pushed to do slideshow, it took the share screen. Can you do something to stop the water for a minute?
Monkey to the rescue.
Yeah, I can do it from here. Hang on just a second. Thank you, Susan. Sorry, we're two of us working the things today. Okay. Let's do the sign. Okay.
Great, Steve, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Steve, is there a way to turn your volume up?
is that any better?
Oh, it is.
Okay.
Okay, hang with us. We'll be okay. That's pretty much.
Yes, it is. Not everything. Yep.
Steve, if not, we can muddle through. I don't want to delay Judith anymore.
You should be okay. We're just.
It'll be all right. It's a good way.
There we go. Susan, can you see it now? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it fine.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I just need to scroll between the slides instead of do the slideshow. Yeah. Okay, ready to go on to the next one, Jude?
Let's go to
Four, report, okay,
okay.
here we go,
So I'm going to pick up in the middle of this page where it describes dopamine
very close to you.
as a chemical that is essential to the processing that goes on in brain cells, transmitting nerve messages that tell muscles to move. So when you don't have enough dopamine, when you've lost it, there isn't enough in the brain, as well as other parts of the body, but it's the brain where the primary focus is. So there's not enough dopamine in the brain for the normal function of the neurotransmitter. So there's not enough of it being sent out into all the areas of the brain because it's no longer being produced at a rate high enough to supply the brain's needs. The result is that there's decreased control by you and me over movement. Our mobility gets mixed up also, and eventually we are not able to move normally any longer. And at that point in time, you typically have enough symptoms that even though you won't be diagnosed strictly on the basis of symptoms, the symptoms will be such that they're noticeable by you at least, if not by other people who are very good at such things. So the little diagram there, the primary thing that I would hope you would get from it is deep in the brain are the cells that produce this chemical called dopamine. And it goes out to all kinds of different places in the brain, affecting your ability to move. There are some other movement disorders. You've probably heard of some of these, like ALS and Huntington's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the #1 movement disorder in the world and in the US. Alzheimer's. I'm sorry, it's a dementia. Forgive me, wipe that off. Not the movement disorder. Parkinson is the #1 movement disorder. Alzheimer's is the #1 question of cognition and potential dementia. And that is, Alzheimer's is the #1 form of that. But Parkinson has a potential, and I emphasize potential, dementia component that is not Alzheimer's. And it is not Alzheimer's-like. It is a different form of dementia. And we will talk about that in a little bit. A couple of other things, MSA and PSP, you may have heard of. Dementia with Lewy bodies at the bottom of the list there is the one that is affiliated with Parkinson. You have a question?
No, I wondered if we need the next slide.
The slides on the screen here are not changing.
Oh, okay. Susan, which one on Zoom are you seeing?
Dopamine pathways in the brain.
That's the diagram.
Okay, it's, when I click on my laptop, it's not changing for you on Zoom or on screen, but it is changing on the laptop. Murphy's Law, if anything can go wrong, it will.
Can you explain Lewy bodies better?
Yes, I can. And I'm going to do that a little bit later, Carol.
Okay.
But I have a page that will address Lewy bodies.
Apologies to everyone, including Zoomers. Totally sorry.
Question, Judith,
Yes,
is Alzheimer's spectrum synonymous with Alzheimer's disease?
I don't know the term
Go.
Alzheimer's spectrum as a medical term. I'm sure it's out there if you run across it. Spectrum means what's the most basic, least impacting form of a condition to the very worst. So there's a whole spectrum. And so what that means is that you can have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and you can have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and they may not actually look very much alike, even though the fundamental condition is the same. Does that make sense?
It does. We know two people who have recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it's Alzheimer's spectrum. You know, and I thought maybe the terminology had changed.
Well, that's a fairly new term as far as I'm concerned. But generally, when you talk about spectrum of any condition, you're talking about the range from the least impact, but you know you have it, to the greatest impact. Mhm.
And Linda, that may be partly, correct me if I'm wrong, Judith, but that may be partly that Alzheimer's is actually quite difficult to diagnose.
Mhm.
I mean, there's no one test
Right.
you can run.
And Parkinson is the same way.
Exactly. And so sometimes they may be using that term as, well, it kind of looks like Alzheimer's, and we'll see with time if it progresses like Alzheimer's does. So it's
And a precursor could even be mild cognitive impairment.
Right.
Which is a
absolutely.
common term.
Well, that's all of us. Right?
There's also,
Well, Linda, we laugh at that, but in truth, this is the fact. The dopamine chemical and cycle are organic. We are organic. We know that organic things wear out. If everybody in this country had no medical condition whatsoever, when they get to the age of 95, they probably have a 5 to 10% decrement in normal brain functioning, even if they've never had any kind of dementia diagnosis or problem or anything. So we all have some degradation over time. The people with Parkinson are at the front of the pack, which is supposed to be funny. No, but seriously, it's not a package you want to leave. But that's the truth. Each one of us, whether we had Parkinson or not, would have some degree of degradation in the cognition function as we age. And that is why Parkinson is identified as a disease of older people, because the older you get, the higher the possibility that you're going to end up with that diagnosis.
Judith, quick question if I could.
Sure.
I know more people are being diagnosed today than ever before, I believe, with Parkinson. Not just because baby boomers are so more plentiful, but other reasons. Tell us about that for a minute, if that's not jumping ahead too far.
It's jumping ahead, but let's cover it when it comes up,
Okay.
which is good to do. I actually have a slide here, which I'm going to flip through.
Sorry if I'm getting you out of sync here.
That's all right. It's a good question, and I think some others of you had it.
Because I believe Ken has told me it's partially due to pesticides, Roundup in particular, that people have used on their lawns and
Okay.
other places.
The cause of Parkinson is not clearly defined. We have lots of associations. An association does not mean that one is a cause and the other is the effect. An association means that these things tend to occur parallel. There are some of those that impact the diagnosis of Parkinson. Parkinson, like Alzheimer's, is a diagnosis of exclusion. That means you go through all the things that you think it might be, and you prove that it's not any of them. And you're left with a Parkinson diagnosis, which you then treat. And that either confirms or denies, if you will, that it is the correct diagnosis. What are some of the things going on? Carol asked about Lewy bodies. Lewy bodies are a result of a chemical protein, basically called synuclein, SYNUCLEIN. And synuclein as a protein sometimes gets twisted, wrapped around something in the cell manufacturing process, gets bent, literally, the protein, so it's bent out of its normal functional shape. When that happens and a group of these cells clump together, those are called Lewy bodies. They can attach and get bigger and bigger, like in the area of the brain that produces the dopamine cells or the dopamine chemical. And when that happens, they can clog the entire circulation system in the brain and prevent you from having certain types of cognition comfortably functional. So that is part of the story. And Steve alluded to another part. We are discovering more associations the longer we live with this condition. For instance, something called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Okay, CTE, soccer, headers, football, boxing. Well, who's probably the most famous sports person with Parkinson?
Muhammad Ali.
Muhammad Ali. Mhm. So that's why when we talk about boxing for Parkinson treatment, it's non-contact. The other area that has recently come to attention as a potential cause is exposure to toxins, chemical toxins. I was a little kid in the early 50s. I ran out into the fields where my farming dad was working, and I'd take him lunch and water, and I'd get to play in that freshly tilled dirt with my bare feet, and it was great. And now I have Parkinson. Now, is it cause effect? Nope, we don't have that. Will we? I suspect that one of these days we're going to find a more direct connection than we have now. But the association is remarkable enough to pay attention to it. My sister has MS. There's no MS, there's no Parkinson in either of our families anywhere. But we both have movement disorders. And we grew up in the same space and doing the same kinds of things. So it makes it kind of suspicious, to say the least. Watch the progress of research, because we will have an answer to this. Is a familial component present in Parkinson? 5 to 10% maybe. But when you find a family who has it, you will see generation. And it's sometimes really stunning. There's currently research going on as to whether or not Parkinson starts in the gut. We're discovering that the gut is the center of a lot of conditions that develop over time as we age. Autoimmune component unknown, but once again, with this kind of condition, it's in the suspicious category that there might be some autoimmune element involved. So extensive research going on about that, and when we get to that slide, we'll see. Okay. Let's go to slide 8.
Okay.
Slide 8 is just some interesting things, but information that is current as well as we know. There's 2 forms of it. There's young onset and there's normal onset, if you can imagine such a thing. Young onset occurs in people under the age of 50. Okay, I have personally known someone diagnosed as young as the age of 24, which is really, that's an abnormal thing, but I mean, that's the extreme. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of all diagnoses in the US are young onset. And as we go through this next few slides, you may start wondering, wow, how does somebody keep a job, have kids, do all the kid things and so on?
Sure.
With that as the complicator that early in their life. Okay, others, the median age at diagnosis is 62.5. So I'm median. I was 62 and a half when I was diagnosed.
Ask also, Mary and Jean Dawson in our class just had a son that was diagnosed with, how old was your son?
60, just turned 60.
Just turned 60, thank you.
So let me interrupt her just for a minute. You've raised an interesting question, Steve. How many of you either know someone or have a relative who has Parkinson?
Wow.
But everybody here.
This is a widespread and going fast condition. We've had to revise estimates of its incidence and prevalence because there's some very good research work that's been done in the last 10 years. The last set of statistics like you have here in the PD facts was done in the 70s. And so they knew that they were way behind. And last fall, the results of some very rigorous, well-structured research indicated that there are between 10 and 12 million people in the world with this condition, and it's on its way up. In the US, our best estimate is about 1.5 million.
Wow.
In Colorado, there are 25,000 people with this condition. Now, where are those people? Colorado, it's pretty easy. They're along the Front Range because that's where the population is. So the bulk of Colorado's Parkinson condition is going to be seen on the Front Range. But these numbers were increased by a factor of 1.5% to that study that was released last fall. So we thought we had 17,000 people in Colorado. We really have about 25,000. Impact is huge, as you will see. There's an interesting, towards the bottom, you will see approximately 90,000 new diagnoses annually in the US. That's a small city. or maybe not so small theater.
245 a day.
245 daily,
Wow.
7 days a week, every day. And approximately 1 in 300 people, adults, will have that condition at some point in their life. I like to give an illustration of that by saying, let's say you go to church Sunday and there's 1,000 people in that service. 3 or 4 of those folks, whether they know it or not, are going to have Parkinson's. That bringing those numbers a little closer to home can help you put a picture. The next item on this fact sheet that really is staggering is the cost of this condition to the economy. $52 billion a year. Lost work time, lost social benefits, treatment costs, medication costs for Parkinson they're like everything else. They are ridiculous. But the medicines work and you pay. There's a battle that will ensue in the next few years about how much the government is going to continue paying, particularly on some of the newer medications. That it'll be interesting. Another interesting fact is that in the US, the diagnostic ratio is 3 to 2 men over women. But my experience around the Denver area has not particularly supported that. There are things I am involved in where I see it clearly and things I'm involved in where women are by far outnumber men. So I don't know if there's much to put by that. Okay, let's move on, Steve.
Okay.
It takes a long time for the dopamine cells to be degrading enough that you don't have adequate dopamine in your brain system any longer. It takes a long time. It takes many, many years. You can have pre-diagnostic symptoms 10, 15, 20 years before the disease presents itself overtly. Examples of things, and I oftentimes when we're talking to folks, I oftentimes will have a response from somebody in the audience that says, oh yeah, I had such and such like you just described. Okay, what are some of these early symptoms before diagnosis? There's a condition called anosmia. And what it means is you've lost your sense of smell. No, I lost my sense of smell when I was in my late 20s. Had nothing to tie it to at the time, but I couldn't smell stuff. Still can't. The NIH does a smell study that gives you 40 different odors one at a time. It gives you 40 one odor will have 4 options as to what it is. Only one is correct. They go through these 40. I failed that with just incredible success. It was amazing. There were things that I could not get. Now, there is a smell that I get nearly any time I'm close to it. And that is, interestingly enough, the odor of petrochemicals. Driving into a gas station, for instance. I get that, but I get very little on a consistent basis, and there are many smells I don't get at all. That's a common finding in many people with Parkinson. Okay, real quickly. Flat faces you may have heard called pancake face. That's what it looks like. No expression whatsoever. Can't even smile. I had that condition right at the beginning. Look at that.
Yeah, you're smiling.
And what I found, fortunately, is that once I got on medication and that medication was stabilized and it was the right medicine, it was the right dosing, my wrinkles came back. And I submit to you that I am probably the only person in this room who gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror and smiles and says, "Good, my wrinkles are." Because that means that my treatment is appropriate and working. So flat faces. Tremor, you have seen the Parkinson tremor. It can be very mild. It can be really severe. There are also non-tremor forms, which I have. Okay, so there's different ways that Parkinson presents itself. Some of the earlier symptoms, again, we get, what am I forgetting? It's okay. Micrographia is an interesting one. Micrographia, micro really tiny, graphia writing, very tiny writing. Steve told you I'm a
there.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Steve told you I'm a physician. And I work with, no longer I'm retired, but I work with nurses, MAs, all kinds of medical people. And I had one nurse whom I just loved dearly. And my writing had gotten to the point that I didn't realize that it was a problem. But she came into me one day and she said, Judith, you know, you write the clearest, most beautiful prescriptions. Would you bring in a magnifying glass so that I could read them, please? So that is true. I mean, the writing is very clear, but you can't see it.
Very
It's
small.
so tiny. And that is almost diagnostic of itself because it's not seen in any other medical condition. Depression and anxiety are common, softening voice. GI problems are just terrible for almost everybody with Parkinson. And we mentioned the tremor. The tremor usually is what we call unilateral, one side or the other, but not both to start with. Okay, so we talked about tremor and non-tremor as two different ways of defining Parkinson. The more common ways are motor and non-motor. So motor symptoms are actually related to the production of a motor action, such as walking. That's a motor function. That's one of the things that is impacted dramatically by Parkinson. Your posture. I constantly have to work at sitting up because this is what happens in the Parkinson patient who doesn't work at sitting up. Dottie can probably tell you horror stories about that. Freezing of your gait. Have you ever seen someone walking along with fairly short or shuffling steps?
Sure.
And then they stop. They can't keep going, and then they have to struggle to get going again. And stay that way. So stupid posture, frozen gait. So some of the more acute problems that we'll just hit a couple in here. Impaired dexterity is one. You know, we're all used to using our fingers and thumbs. We do buttons, we do fine kitchen work, we run zippers, whatever. And the Parkinson person oftentimes has a lot of challenge with that. Trying to get that button that may be a quarter of an inch, half an inch, maybe through that buttonhole, but you can't even grasp the little button to start with, and then you have to try to get the buttonhole, and so on and so on and so on. Those kinds of things are aggravating, anytime, day or night. Solutions to them, yeah. If you are one of the folks that has Parkinson, you know, or if you see someone you know struggling with trying to put buttons together or zipper, have them take a break. Try this for about 20 seconds. So what are you doing here? You're loosening it up. You're getting some flexibility, and oftentimes it'll work better. Some other motor symptoms. Oh, difficulty in swallowing is an important one because that becomes a problem in later years. So you need to be working with speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. You need a team of people when you have this condition. I think we'll move on.
Okay.
So there's motor symptoms, there's non-motor symptoms. So these are the symptoms that accompany the diagnosis, but are not necessarily directly related to movement like walking. And you can see on this list, there is a sleep disorder form. Your deep sleep gets interrupted. There's the GI problem again. There's the smelling or lack of ability to smell. Orthostatic hypotension is a big long set of letters stuck together. What it really means, you got to get up from a sitting or a lying down position slowly, or you're going to go right down. Now that can happen to somebody without Parkinson, because when you stand up too quickly, blood drains down and you don't have the oxygen in the brain, you're going to fall. This is an exaggerated problem for the person with Parkinson. So if you are with someone or if you're caring for someone who has Parkinson, that is a big deal to pay attention to, that they are getting up and down appropriately and not falling. Bladder and sexual dysfunction are common, and mental health issues. It is estimated that 50% of the people at their first diagnosis of Parkinson's disease have concurrent clinically designated depression. It's treatable. And it's important to get it treated, because by getting it treated, you make the possibility much greater that you're going to be able to control many of the other things going on with your Parkinson, and you're going to have a lot more stable, even life. Okay.
Judith, can I mention we've got 15 minutes
Yes.
left?
I'm looking at that clock.
I know she's not gonna make it through all her slides today. She might come back again for another session. And we want to give time to Ken to tell us a little about being a support also.
I'm going to cut myself off in less than 5 minutes. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Okay, so we've covered some of these next ones. Could you go to progression?
Get on to progression. Okay.
Yes. Everybody that has Parkinson's disease has Parkinson's disease. They all recognize that by a common definition. But not everybody, in fact, rarely can you ever find two people with that diagnosis who present the same way. There are little niggles of difference here, there, and everywhere in the condition. And that'll show oftentimes in your symptoms. But, you know, it's just not predictable. You'd like the doctor to be able to say to you, next month, 6 months, 2 years, whatever, this is what will be happening. Can't do that. It's not there. Okay, let's do the diagram. This is a real quick diagram on how it happens.
Diagram.
It's not that one.
This one.
Yeah, it's not a diagram. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So what happens? You go to your PCP, who you say, you know, I've got this funny drag in my left foot. It seems like it's sliding instead of slipping. And your doc examines and asks questions and sends you to a neurologist. And your neurologist says, I think you probably have Parkinson, but let's have you see the movement disorder specialist. That's a medical term that applies now to the person who has gone through medical school, has gone through a full residency in neurology, and then tacks on approximately a 5-year program of clinical and lab research. So this is a person who has truly specialized and knows as much as anybody in your community is going to know. So always, if you or a friend or a relative are being treated or are suspicious of having Parkinson, try to see a movement disorder specialist. There's lots of them in Denver.
Interesting.
Okay, I'm going to leave you in suspense. Let's go one more, Steve. If you're sitting in the specialist's office and there's this white coat that comes rushing in, sits down.
Close line.
I'm sorry. You're sitting in this doc's office. You've never met the doc's never met you. You have no idea what you're going to hear, but you don't think it's going to be good. And the doc comes rushing in and very quickly informs you that we think you have Parkinson's disease. What's your reaction going to be? Probably not very, very good in any respect. And oftentimes, that's when the blinders go on and you can't hear anything either. So you come out of that going, what's happening to me? Am I going to die as a result of this? What did I do wrong? You know, why do I have this? And on and on and on. That individual needs two things at that moment. Needs to have with him or her right then someone who can act as a secretary. Every single thing that you get told, you're not going to remember any of it in the first few visits. But if you have your support partner with you, that person is your secretary in that situation. So you need to have all the information, and you can't possibly absorb it as you're sitting there trying to think, what in the world is going on? So, bottom of the page, is the most important thing to this point in time. People do not die of Parkinson. They may die of complications from Parkinson, but it's not Parkinson's disease itself. And with that, I'm going to let Ken pick up on it.
Can I ask a quick question before we go?
Absolutely.
Before we forget this one, how did it affect your faith as a Christian?
Well, that's an easy one.
Well, yeah, how did it affect my faith? I don't believe in a God of micromanagement. And I believe that there are things that happen that we may not have an explanation for. We're trying to find the explanation for this one. My faith in God is not substantially different than before I was diagnosed in terms of this kind of happening in my life. I have a community. I have a community at St. Andrew. I have a community, actually several Parkinson communities. Those things are the things that answer your question for me, Steve.
Good. God's with you through this.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
Gotcha.
That's okay. We'll shut it off. You got a big voice, Ken. It'll carry you to the back. You can use that. You want to use it?
Let's see.
Presentation.
Okay.
I'm gonna stop sharing that one.
Yeah.
Okay,
And the pictures of the,
no, I have a PowerPoint presentation.
the tandem slideshow.
No,
No, sorry. Which one was it?
care partner.
Care partner. Oh, you didn't have me pull that one off? Oh, wait a minute. Yes, you did.
Work. There you go.
Support partner. Okay, well, we're opening it here. Takes a second. Ken, were you with her when you got the diagnosis?
Sure.
Okay. One slideshow, the screen share this.
On that screen. Go back to Zoom.
Yep. You can tell we didn't rehearse this. This is improvised. Screen share. The Zoomers can see it. There we go. Okay. Okay, Ken, already.
All right, next slide.
Slide.
All right, so you were asking about receiving the diagnosis. We had some experience with a kind of a folk country group called Four Bitchin' Babes.
Okay.
And Debbie is a part of that. And she wrote a song. And it's
The handout here.
it's called Italy and France. And it talks about, I believe, having a child receive a diagnosis of Down syndrome. And the impact that has on the life that you're going to have, not the life that you envisioned. The same thing, many years before that, Welcome to Holland. Again, Down syndrome diagnosis. And these kind of events are really deflective in that it's like getting a cancer diagnosis or getting a PD diagnosis or getting a ALS diagnosis or getting a Down syndrome diagnosis. And so That's why I went ahead and printed these off and handed them out to indicate that the life that you thought you were going to have is no longer the life that you are going to have. Now, there are things you can do. Next slide. Yes, next slide, please.
Reaction.
Your future's been irrevocably changed. And a new care partner can get out of the future only by walking away. And there have been people who have done that. They get that kind of diagnosis and they say, I'm not going to be able to live that life in a kind of a selfish way, or I'm not going to be able to handle the emotional and physical burdens that come with that. You can stay in the relationship, but refuse to assume the responsibilities. And that can last for Parkinson's disease. The first 5 years are the honeymoon phase. The medicines work well. The person with Parkinson's is very functional and life continues much as it has been. However, if you choose the denial, that can only last 5 to 10 years, and then you're going to get into the real care partner problem. Next. Okay, so in the promises we made when we wed, in a Christian sense, we don't walk away. We don't fall out of love. We don't abandon the person who got the diagnosis. Now, as Judith was talking about, our first fear, because we don't know much, is that PD is a death sentence. And education about that idea begins with a search for Parkinson's disease life expectancy in your Google bar. And eventually you can come across a recent study that was published, and it's peer-reviewed study of the study of life expectancy. Next slide. Okay, PD is caused by the activation of a genetically based creation of a deformed or bent form of a protein called alpha-synuclein in the brain. And excess amounts of that deformed protein are absorbed by brain cells. The deformed alpha-synuclein molecules are not or cannot be properly disposed of by the normal cell cleaning process, and so aggregate in the brain cell into Lewy bodies, eventually causing brain cell death. The problem with that is that when the cell dies and ruptures, then all that bent form alpha-synuclein is now free to wander around inside the brain and be absorbed by other brain cells. So this can be actually an exponential kind of process. Usually the brain cell death first occurs in the dopamine producing cells. Their death in the substantia nigra leads to motor control problems that are characteristically seen first. So you get the problem, physical problems. Back in, when Judith was going through residency, we used to run something called the St. Paul Loop in Concord, New Hampshire, which was about a 5-mile run. And it became apparent that her left foot plant was a slap. It was not a heel toe thing. It went flat. We heard a girl out here on Highline Canal with that same thing. And I looked at Judith and I said, should we tell her?
Oh, interesting.
Wow.
My goodness. In other cases, the brain cell death occurs in the cerebral cortex, leading to dementia, Lewy body. There are many signs and symptoms about the presence of the disease. The sequence of occurrence of these indicators is different for each person with Parkinson's, depending on which brain cells die. Now, you need dopamine also in the cerebral cortex, and so when it's not present, then the brain cells can't connect and you lose your memories. Excellent.
Ken, we just
And
have
we're
2
going-
minutes
yes.
left, and did you tell the lady with the foot?
No,
slap?
she was going too fast, I couldn't. Okay, it's not a death sentence, good or bad. Good, that life will proceed. Bad, that it will proceed with the disease and its progression. We'll basically stop there. The burdens that the support partner are going to assume will go from helping to button buttons to having to help with bathroom and shower, to incontinence and dealing with that, to having to do the cooking. And it can get very intense. And the decision to stay means that you've accepted that possible future.
Let's do the last few minutes of questions and conversation.
The slideshow will be like,
Pardon me?
could we do the slideshow at the same time?
Sure, yeah, I'll get it going.
Cause I want you to know that it isn't gloom and doom. And we've got some pictures, 3 or 4, that hopefully. will-
Judith, here. Folks,
Let's make this quick. But I just want you to see some pictures that suggest things that we have done since the diagnosis, okay? And the diagnosis was in July of 2011.
tell about your bicycling trips.
Yeah.
Judith.
Some of you have at times received some of our writings about bicycle trips across Iowa, RAGBRAI. And some of these reflect that. This is Ken dipping the back tire of our tandem
Just like I need to hit share
in the
screen.
Missouri River, which is the start of the RAGBRAI. 7 days later, you put the front wheel in the Mississippi River, having ridden across the state of Iowa. And you've done that with about between 15 and 20,000 of your closest friends. So this is actually a local ride. Michael J. Fox Foundation does a one day event. This is Ken dipping the rear tire in Missouri because we had to be a ways away from there to camp that night. This is our uniform, Evel Knievel. And it was the uniform that the team of 76 of us who were riding on the day was Davis Finney Day. Davis Finney is the blue guy there. The day that was dedicated Davis Finney Day on RAGBRAI, the last year that we were able to ride in 2019. Davis Finney was the most prolific winner of medals in international competition that the U.S. has ever seen. Won more medals for the U.S. in biking than anybody before or since. Wow. This is another finish. We saw the front wheel. These were our mascots on the ride. Yeah. And this was one of our more infamous attempts to climb to basically the Durango to Silverton, right? This is boxing. That is not me, but it's one of my really good friends. And we're back where we were. So.
All right, questions? Go ahead.
Mary and I are most interested in neurocognitive disorders because we have 2 sons. We have one son, birth defect with hydrocephalus, and then with Chris now with the recent PD diagnosis. Our son with the intellectual disability is now a candidate for the black belt in Taekwondo. We have noted a dramatic improvement in cognitive functioning, motor functioning. We're most interested in this. All of us in this room, the benefits of exercise, there's so much literature and support research on the efficacy of research for enhancing successful aging on all domains. You've given briefly an overview of your exercise regimen, just You have much more, I know, we know. Why is it important as couples to do this together? Because you do it together. You don't do it separately. Would you say anything about couples?
Yeah, I'll
Those who
say
are
something
fortunate
about
to
it.
be in a couple relationship.
I'm not a biker to start with.
That-
I'm not a biker to start with. I'm really not. I rode very little. I rode very little and on equipment that was old at the time. I need a partner to ride if I'm going to ride. That's one thing. But the other end of that, Gene, is that for me, Ken holds my feet to the floor on this. No, we're gonna go out today, and I do the same for him. You know, we call each other to account. And it's also just a heck of a lot more fun to share some of the goofy things that happen when you're out on a ride than if you were by yourself and had nobody to talk about that with, nobody to tell it to. Nothing. So there's a lot of psychology in that, Gene. From my
Yes.
Do you know of any research, I'm into cellular research. Do you know of any research going on to discover the cause of the bending of that protein that causes all this?
There is a lot of work being done in genetics. And there are some hereditary forms of Parkinson's disease. And the GBA gene and another one I've forgotten which, if you have them, then you are going to have Parkinson's. The trick is that we don't know what turns on the gene that starts producing the bent form of alpha-synuclein. And we don't know how to turn it off. So, yes, there is research being done and tremendous tools are being developed. For example, there is now a tag that can be put, injected in your blood that will go ahead and bind to alpha-synuclein. And for the first time, we can actually see and measure the presence, location, and density of alpha-synuclein in the brain. And that's within the last year.
progress is happening.
Yes,
Dopamine is a key to this, the manufacture of your brain. Is there any where you manufacture that outside the brain
the
and then inject it into the
medicine
brain?
carbidopa levodopa actually is formulated, is the primary medicine for Parkinson's, and it is formulated such that it can get through the blood-brain barrier. And that's been a real problem with, and once it gets through there, then the brain has processes by which it is able to convert what gets through that barrier into dopamine.
Excuse me, at the same time, there are medications that are analogs that can be converted in the brain once you have them on board. So that the brain attacks that from two directions. One is inherently, and the other is by the form of a medicine.
We need to wrap up. We are over time.
Sorry.
We will ask Ken and Judith to come back again.
Yes.
But we do need to be out because there's another group in this room in 20 minutes. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Zoomers. Thank you, Ken and Judith. And we pray that the Lord will be with you and bless you in your journey. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Judith. Bye-bye.
What you need is someone to be here and get likes.